Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Regulatory Transparency Project webinar titled America's AI Action Plan, Green Lights or Guardrails. We're so excited that you're able to join us today. My name is Libby Dickinson, and I'm an Assistant Director with the Federalist Society's practice groups and the Regulatory Transparency Project. As a reminder, all opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not of the Federalist Society. We're honored to be joined today by an excellent panel of tech and legal experts addressing the recent release of President Trump's AI Action Plan, which is linked in the Resources tab at the bottom of your screen, listed under Documents. You can also access several impressive articles from our panelists listed under Links, also under Resources. After the panel discussion, there will be a short period designated for audience questions. We ask that you submit them via Zoom's Q&A feature, also at the bottom of your screen, and not the chat, and that they are pertinent to the topic at hand. In order to get right to the discussion, I'll start by briefly introducing each panelist and then hand things over to our moderator to start the conversation. To that point, our expert panel today includes Neil Chilson, Head of AI Policy at the Abundance Institute, Asad Ramzanali, Director of Artificial Intelligence and Technology Policy at Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator with Vanderbilt University, and Professor Mario Loyola of Florida International University and Senior Fellow in Law, Economics, and Technology at the Heritage Foundation. Our moderator today is Professor Kevin Frazier, AI Innovation and Law Fellow at the University of Texas School of Law. You can find out more about today's moderator and panelists at fedsoc.org, that is fedsoc.org, or their profiles are also listed under the Speakers tab under Resources. With that, I will hand things off to Kevin to get us started. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Libby, and thank you to Mario, Neil, and Assad for making this possible. As everyone who studies AI policy knows, Christmas did come in July. We waited about 180 days for the AI action plan after President Trump's day one rescission of much of the Biden administration's work on AI. And then, as promised, we got our AI action plan. 90 recommendations, 3 pillars, and 3 principles. There's so much to dive into, and we will try to cover it all. But first, I just want to get a sense from our fantastic panel of what their sort of short takeaway is. If they could tweet out one thing, what would they have to say about this AI action plan? So, Neil, you and I go way back. Why don't we start with you? What's your big takeaway from the AI action plan?
I probably actually did tweet out something right away, so I should go back and look at what I said there. But it's great to be here with the FedSoc, obviously, and great to be here with these great panelists. My top takeaway is this is a 180 in emphasis from the Biden administration, a complete pivot from approaching AI as something to be cautious about and a potential risk to something that is primarily an opportunity, and not just an opportunity, but a critical opportunity for the United States to seize.
All right, Assad, why don't we go to you next?
Thanks for having me as well. I'd say it's a mix of good and bad ideas, but it's overshadowed by the administration's actions that hurt American AI leadership in a number of domains. And generally, there's too much of a giveaway to big tech. Hopefully I stayed in the character count there.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think that was maybe even just 120 characters. We'll save a bunch of hashtags for later. Mario, how about you?
Thank you for having me. It's great to be on with such a great panel. I am not going to stay within the character count for a tweet, but I will try to just say a few words. I think I see also this sort of, this fascinating tension in all of the AI policy domains between the people who are more worried about safety and the people who are more excited about the opportunity. This tension shows up in each of the 3 major pillars of the AI action plan. Whether abroad, looking abroad, do we want to hold our adversaries back, or is our approach to win harder? In the words of Dylan Patel. And at the root of this is, is this something that you're more worried about, or is it something that you're more excited about? I think this kind of basic psychological predisposition is what I think creates this sort of spectrum of opinion between the people who are more inclined to be more cautious and more focused on safety versus the people who are more inclined to be optimistic and pro-innovation. And I think that there's a sort of Venn diagram of the people on that spectrum with another spectrum, which is just a traditional how skeptical or excited are you about the idea of heavy-handed government interventions in the private economy? And those, heavy-handed government intervention in the private economy has come back in fashion on both the right and the left, and in certain quarters. Um, I believe that faith in heavy-handed government interventions is not justified by the history of heavy-handed government interventions, but it's clear that that part of the Venn diagram, that's people who are skeptical of heavy-handed government interventions and more excited than worried about the possibilities of AI, have the president's ear and are shaping policy and certainly shaped this AI action plan.
Okay, so a little bit more of a tweet thread there, but very, very much appreciated. So, given the importance of seeing this AI policy holistically, as Assad was pointing out, and I think is critical to getting a sense of what this pivot, as Neil suggested, may mean for the future of AI in the US, let's briefly just go back to the past and get a sense of where were we coming from with respect to AI policy under the first Trump administration. So, Neil, can you describe how the first Trump administration was thinking about AI and whether this marks a big leap from what we had seen previously, or if this is a sort of continuation?
So the first Trump administration, obviously, this is a completely different context. Pre-Chat GPT, AI was something that some of us computer science nerds paid a lot of attention to, but it really wasn't in the headlines often. It was still more sci-fi conversation. That's how I think pop culture talked about it rather than actual product. But the Trump administration actually did take some actions, and some of that's because the leadership in Trump 1 in OSTP was the same, right? So, and so we have the Trump 1 taking doing some initial executive orders that are about government use of AI and very exploratory types of things that were didn't have the sort of big thematic overview that the AI action plan does. There wasn't a document that looked like that. But there were some initial executive orders that sort of like we're trying to lay the groundwork for government adopting AI and how they might procure it, et cetera. And so not a ton there, but I think directionally very similar, seeing it as an opportunity, even if the scope of that opportunity wasn't as obvious under Trump 1 as it is today.
Yeah, if only we all knew what was going to happen with respect to AI, we would have just all invested our life savings in NVIDIA and been sitting pretty. But we'll leave financial advice for another podcast. Assad, I want to come to you for whether we saw a big departure from that initial Trump 1 approach to AI during the Biden administration, or what sort of nuances and changes we saw occur under the Biden administration.
Yeah, so during the Biden administration, I think the big thing that happens in the middle of it is ChatGPT. So AI goes from, Neil, things you and I were worried about and advocating for Nair and things like that, to my parents have used it and know what it's about and like have a point of view, right? So that mainstreaming happens in the middle of it. At the beginning of that midpoint, you get things like the Nair task force that actually Lynn Parker continued into the Biden administration and led that effort in I thought, a great way. But you also get the AI Bill of Rights, the blueprint for a Bill of Rights. And then shortly after the ChatGPT moment, you get an executive order that has a lot of things thinking about guardrails, though I don't think it was a heavy-handed regulation, mostly because of the limits of what executive power alone can do. Congress didn't, implement a lot of that. But you get how do we encourage and how do you think about guardrails? So that executive order has a few transparency requirements, but it also has a number of why don't we think about principles for workers? And a lot of those were kind of voluntary thinking. From there, the Biden administration, I'd say, continued a lot of Trump 1's focus on how to think about our adversarial relationships with China and with other countries, especially as it relates to chips and exporting technologies. We did a number of things on the international front as well. So I'd say it was a little bit of a continuation, but a kind of resetting into the reality of AI being mainstreamed in a way, and trying to think through not just the LLM world of AI, but also the broader set of automating technologies that have shown up in our lives and we've seen issues. And so that's how I'd characterize it.
Yeah, and if we thought that AI was complex during the Biden administration, things have only become way more hectic under Trump too. And so, Mario, we have this day one rescission of much of the Biden era approach to AI, removal of much of the executive orders, including the executive order specifying the sort of AI Bill of Rights. So, what does the AI action plan actually say? Can you give us just a high level overview of those three different pillars?
So the basic pillars are, first of all, a whole series of proposals around accelerating innovation. Clearly, I would say here, a very permissionless innovation approach. Generally, it seems to be the default setting. And I'll give some examples that were, in some cases, really, really notable examples of that. And again, examples that show the kind of pro-innovation and skeptical of the efficaciousness of government intervention kind of a orientation. Then the second pillar sort of recognizes the need that this is a huge physical infrastructure build out that's going to require an enormous amount of manufacturing capacity, an enormous amount of energy capacity. Not a lot of solutions there, only because infrastructure is an area where like Congress has created a lot of problems that only Congress can really solve. And so a lot of those obstacles are ones that Congress is looking at, and I think the administration will be working closely with Congress on those. And then the third pillar is looking abroad, and we can, and that's this sort of leading with the idea of the U.S. tech, the AI revolution, U.S. tech leadership, U.S. AI leadership depends on the global AI revolution being an American AI stack revolution, right? It depends on global adoption of the American model. And of course, we're not the only country that's saying that, right? There's also this document called the New Generation AI Plan that was put out by the Chinese Communist Party State Council in 2017 that says basically exactly the same thing, right? About China. And so we have this global competition that I think is that the AI action plan has to contend with, and I think there's going to be more shoes to drop there. One of the lines of continuity and significant refinement and work since Trump won was around the introduction of the first export controls on semiconductors, which I believe was in 2018. That effort went, I think the administration thinks, very far in just an overbroad, overly heavy-handed direction with the AI diffusion framework released in the final weeks of the Biden administration. But there is going to be some export control because of the national security risks of AI, and we can get into those.
Yeah, and
That's the high level.
so we have this high level overview of three pillars: innovation, infrastructure, and international diplomacy and security. But the AI action plan wasn't released solely as a plan. We saw some follow on executive orders. Assad, can you walk us through some of the executive orders that were released in the wake of the AI action plan?
Yeah, so the three executive orders which President Trump signed that evening, the evening of the action plan, fell kind of roughly in the same three pillars, or they picked one subset of the pillars and kind of expanded on it. One focused on AI data centers, the infrastructure pillar that Mario outlined, and how to think about environmental and permitting pieces of that, what can be waived, what can be sped up. In my view, that's a version of a Biden administration EO, which was in January, the end of the administration. That was a little bit more, that was a lot more industry friendly here to kind of really put pedal to the metal on AI data infrastructure, data center infrastructure construction in the kind of nicest way of saying it. The other way of saying it is waiving all the other values that one might care about. A second EO focused on the international pieces of this and the kind of globalizing of the full stack of AI. So thinking not just about the chips, which I think was a lot of the focus of Trump 1 and also in the Biden era, but all the way up. And then the third was a little bit less aligned to the pillar structure. Formally, it fell into the accelerating innovation, but the actual executive order was about woke AI, which I have a lot of concerns about. I'm not sure how you do a non-woke AI without creating a government-administered ideological purity test. And I know a lot of people have a lot of different kinds of concerns there. But the idea was to remove ideological bias from AI that the administration is concerned about.
So we have this big spectrum of 90 different recommendations in the plan combined with the executive orders. Neil, what stands out to you as some of the most pivotal or perhaps tangible policies that we think may be impacting the direction of AI development going forward versus some of the recommendations that may be either secondary priorities or tertiary priorities or may otherwise be bottlenecked by other concerns or other actors?
Well, obviously here, the executive orders, as Assad pointed out, can only achieve what the executive branch has the power to do. And so I think one thing that is very interesting about the AI action plan, that if you look at it, it stays within that scope pretty well. This is not an attempt to paint some really huge picture. Say, for example, like framing something like an AI Bill of Rights, right? Like the executive branch cannot create a Bill of Rights, right? And so the AI action plan doesn't try to do that. It stays with very concrete approaches. Now, some of these you could have predicted from just knowing sort of what a sort of typical Republican administration would have do. Some of them you could have predicted from knowing what the Trump administration has emphasized. Some of them actually, I think it wasn't obvious which way the administration was going to go on that. So maybe I'll stick to that third category. And one that's particularly interesting to me there is the discussion about open source and open weight AI. It was not obvious that the Trump administration would come out one particular way on this issue. It also kind of seemed like maybe they would just punt on it. But the action plan has a pretty strong statement about the value of open weight and open source AI, and as part of the creating competition, as part of ensuring that there's open models that are founded on American values, and in part of this attempt to become the global standard. And I think that was really interesting. I think it is really important that the administration put its flag in the ground for open source and open weight AI. And so that one really stands out to me. Some of the other ones that stand out include a lot of the discussion about empowering workers in AI. This is a vision. The vision in the document, it emphasizes workers a lot in here, but it very much sees AI as a complement to workers, not a substitute for workers. And the framing of that, I think, is very simpatico, both with an innovation-friendly approach, but also with an interest in making sure that this is good for the American people up and down the stack. And so that approach, I think, also stood out to me quite a lot. And then the third one that I'll just categorize, and to be fair, all of these are in Pillar 1. So maybe I'm leaning in my subject matter expertise more. There are lots of important things in Pillar 2 and 3, but Pillar 1 is the one that jumped out to me the most. And there, I would say the emphasis on the need to invest in AI to enable science. Part of that is building these world-class scientific data sets. And again, this is seeing an opportunity, including an opportunity to free up some of the massive amounts of data that the federal government has that could be used to train these models, and use them to get the major benefit of AI. And that's part of not just what has been the emphasis in many places in AI policy, which has been the sort of the frontier models. That's part of the adoption of these technologies and putting them actually to use. And the AI action plan does a good job, I think, of saying that this isn't just about staying on the cutting edge of the technology. It's also about deploying and using this stuff in our everyday lives and in some of the most important areas that we have, most of the areas of problems and challenges that we have, including healthcare, national security, et cetera. So those are some of the things that stood out to me on this. plan.
Yeah, we've seen some very interesting evolutions in just the nature of AI deployment generally and the nature of these AI models and the conversations we're having around them. And to your point, Neil, I think one that stands out in particular, that transition to embracing open source is something that we hadn't necessarily seen previously. And also trying to find a way in this AI action plan, and Dean Ball, one of the authors of the AI action plan, will testify to this, the difficulty of finding the narrow path between concerns about populist a populist mentality of how do we safeguard communities that we think will be affected by perhaps job displacement and other actions of AI deployment, and on the other side of the equation, the sort of techno libertarian, to the extent anyone wants to explicitly label themselves with such a clunky title, how do you appease both of those communities? That's a really tough task. And I think a lot of folks have been trying to analyze after the fact if the AI action plan sufficiently found a way through both of those concerns. And that is something we'll definitely have to see as execution becomes one of the biggest questions. But before we move on to that execution question, Mario, is there anything from the second or third pillar that you really want to call attention to as being particularly noteworthy?
Um, Lots of interesting things, but I just want to respond to very quickly to the question, the way that you just framed it, which I think is really important. And it may be that the AI action plan only put in sort of the first sorts of principles that we're going to try to follow, as in it, that the administration is going to try to follow in addressing the dislocation, employment effects of AI moving forward. But I'll just say that this is like not a new question, right? And in some senses, this is like all of 20th century welfare economics. This was one of the principal preoccupations of welfare economics as it arose. It gave rise to the principle of allocative efficiency, very important principle. We call it in the law creative destruction. And so there's not really a lot new under the sun here when you think about other technological revolutions that have happened in the past. Dario Amodei and others, and Anthropic and others, they say, well, this time is different because it's attacking the entire skill ladder, not just one part of it. Okay, well, that's an interesting discussion to have. But I think I would, I strongly suspect that it will continue to be the case that the greatest job creator of all is automation. It has always been the case, and it always will be the case. I suspect. I think that a lot of attention was going to how is the administration going to chart this trade-off between export competitiveness and export controls to diminish the risk of global AI diffusion. And I thought it was, again, a very clear, Dean Ball and others, the administration, Mike Kratsios, others in the administration have done a very good job of reconciling these competing priorities. But they clearly, I think that they clearly have stepped away from a heavy regulatory reporting kind of a framework like we saw in the AI diffusion framework to control the problem of hardware transiting through third countries. And then that's on the hardware side of the AI diffusion. Remember that the AI diffusion framework also had this discussion, this applied to the software, which was model weights trained on more than 10 to the 26 flops. And it's been, several statements from the administration. I think that there seems to have been a consensus that was a particularly dumb. I think one of the administration officials used that language to describe it. Part of it. And so what are we looking at there? I think that it's let me see if I can find the page to read some language from this, because it's very interesting. What I think in some cases the AI action plan is as interesting for what it does not say as for what it says. On the export controls, the two things that it talks about are using leveraging new and existing location verification features on advanced AI compute, not advanced chips, advanced AI compute, which is a much more general phrase to use. And so we can get into a little bit of what they might have in mind there. I've done a little bit of research and talking to people about that. And the other one, and this is one that OSTP director Mike Kratsios really stressed in his interesting discussion with Greg Allen at CSIS a week or two ago, is that they are not really worried about where the individual chips are going, because the problem is these big aggregations of chips into data centers that can train frontier models. So what's a big aggregation? 10,000, 20,000 or more chips. And there's pretty clearly a consensus that they're going to try to use all source intelligence to just monitor where those things are being built and what chips they are using. And I think that
So
that's a very important line of effort.
yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but I want to make sure we also get a sense of the difference between what's specifically included in the AI action plan and the goals of the AI action plan as compared to actions that are being taken by the administration in other domains. So Neil pointed out, for example, the call for additional research and investment in scientific uses of AI. There's also calls for enhanced interpretability research, getting to understand how these models are working and why. We also see an emphasis on trying to make sure that the federal government is assisting with mitigating cyber concerns, bioweapon generation, nuclear concerns, and radiological concerns. So there's a huge ambit for more investment in this space and for more talent to be studying these issues as we try to harness the full potential of AI. But Assad, you've written critically about perhaps a bit of a contrast between what we see in the AI action plan and actions the administration's taking in related domains. So, can you flesh that out a little bit for us to see whether these are as congruous as perhaps we'd hope?
Yeah, I think if I think about the things that Neil and Mario just pointed out, there's a lot of them I actually strongly agree with. Neil, your points on open source, open weight. I think this document did a reasonably good job. I don't agree with every detail, but like it's pretty good. And I think I disagree on how we looked at it in the last admin and why we got to those conclusions. And I think it made sense at that time, but now the world has changed in a way that I think this is a pretty good document on that front. I have a lot of other problems with it, but to Kevin, to your point, to me, if the broadest goal here is maintaining or accelerating American leadership in AI, that's a laudable goal. That is something I'm fully on board with. You have to kind of reflect how we got here in the first place. And to me, this is a little bit of a we're burning the bridges behind us of how we actually got here. The way we got here is federal investments in research and development. We invest something like $200 billion a year, the federal government does, in R&D. A lot of that goes to science. And so even if this document calls for using AI in scientific domains, if you cut all biological and chemical and physical research by up to 55% in some cases, who's using that AI, right? So you can't coordinate or strategy your way out of massive cuts. Two, to me, immigration is a huge part of the way we got here. One of my favorite parts of that is our current wave of AI, the transformer model. It's a paper by 8 authors at Google, American company, 8 people working in Mountain View, California. It's a good thing that it's an American company. It's a good thing that it's people in America doing that work. 6 of them are immigrants. 2 of them are children of immigrants. To me, the story there is, as we might do narrow things that we might agree on high-skilled immigration or everything else, but if we signal to every person in the world that you don't want to be an immigrant in America, that's a different kind of challenge that's blowing up how we got here. That's a problem. I won't go into as much detail on them, but to me, antitrust actions across the 1900s have done a lot to open up markets, including the market for AI. And so is the fact that non-competes can't be enforced in California. That's why you get a lot of this innovation in California. The Biden administration, we tried to do that nationally, and that's been held up in courts right now in a way that I'm not as confident that this administration will continue at least trying to make it happen.
So we just have about 25 minutes left in this webinar. A friendly reminder to all the folks who surely have some questions for our panelists to include those in the Q&A feature, and we'll try to get to those with about 15 to 10 minutes remaining. Neil, we've had a little bit of time since the release of the AI action plan to get a sense of how the reaction's going, what perhaps was missing, what perhaps is going to be the most important aspect of this going forward. What is your summary of the response, both from our adversaries? We saw China was actively holding a international discourse on AI around the timing of the release of the AI action plan. We've also seen the release of ChatGPT 5 since the AI action plan got announced. How is this plan being received now being a few weeks from its initial release?
So I think generally, I think Assad's reaction is actually like kind of typical, right? Like across the whole board, right? Across the political spectrum. There's some stuff I like, there's some stuff I don't like, but I think it did, like on some of this, it did a decent job. I'm not sure about, when you put it in the context of the entire administration, obviously there's complexities there. I think the Biden administration had similar cross currents in its efforts. Its action plan or its executive order was, the third longest executive order in history. So maybe they tried to sort of like mash all of that into a single document, but you could see the tensions like in that document itself on that. So, but I think the reception overall has been optimistic, but anticipatory, right? So, well, we got to see how this plays out because there's a lot of action in this action plan. So we need to see like what the government's going to do with this. And one of the key examples there, I think, was the action plan mentions this idea of woke AI or preventing woke AI or biased AI, and there was a lot of swirl about that. And then the executive order came out, and the executive order is pretty cabined compared to like what people thought it might be, right? It's limited explicitly to the models that are purchased by the federal government, and compliance can be done by transparency and disclosure of of the types of shaping of the content that the company does. And so as an example, I think we'll continue to see that over time. I think we're going to have to wait and see what actions come out of this and how the administration moves ahead. And there's a lot to do here. But I'd be remiss if I didn't also say there's a lot that Congress needs to do here as well. The executive branch, for example, cannot by itself set a national standard that's going to preempt, say, the rising wave of state standards. That's something Congress is going to have to do. They attempted to do that with the moratorium fight. There is some language in the action plan that hints at that idea, and it says that we should look at that on a more limited scope of federal AI funding. And so I think there is a lot for Congress to do here. And Congress right now has decided that this is not a big enough priority for it to do it. I always hate it when people are like, Congress isn't going to do something, so the states have to do something. It's kind of like, well, Congress is making choices here, and the choice to not do something in this space is indicative of sort of how they see the world and where they rank this as a priority. And so it is making choices. It needs to make some more choices, and I think it's incumbent on a lot of us to help continue to educate Congress on what needs to happen in this space. The AI action plan provides a template, a direction. I think Congress needs to step in and actually do its role to move things in that direction of AI, U.S. AI dominance.
I think in many ways, the AI action plan is somewhat akin to receiving IKEA furniture. We've got the instructions, but Lord knows there's a big difference between having the IKEA materials and actually building that new bed or what have you. So it will be fascinating to see how quickly things get built, by whom, and in what fashion. But Mario, before we move on to some of the larger ramifications of what this means for AI policy, can you fill us in on what perhaps were some of the omissions in the AI action plan? What didn't we see that is some of the biggest questions about AI policy development in the US?
Well, yeah, great question. I would say, just to follow your IKEA analogy, I hadn't thought of it until now, but there are many respects in which the AI action plan is just giving you the picture of this like amazing piece of furniture, but you don't even have the instructions. So you don't know like how are we actually going to make this happen? And Neil, we've actually alluded, Neil and Asaf have alluded to a couple of these just in the last couple of minutes. Um, we could see for the president on the state patchwork issue. The president himself said in a speech, I wrote down this quote: "We need one common sense federal standard that supersedes all states. You can't have 50 different states regulating this industry." On the other hand, there's a lot of people within the administration. There's a lot of people in the president's base and among the president's supporters who are very concerned that we do need to have standards to protect children, to protect against various social risks. So it's going to be interesting to see how the administration addresses those. The idea of using federal funds in a coercive conditions attached to federal funds, a very popular tool of federal control of states when it comes to like healthcare policy and education policy, how they're going to use it in this narrower context. It's a very, and there was another lever mentioned, which was FCC using and here I'm really on the edge of my seat to find out what this even means. But what we're the Federal Communications Act may have some kind of preemptive, at least dormant preemption kind of a scope here with respect to state regulations. What does that mean? I think that we really need to see the details there. And on the antitrust front, it's very interesting that Department of Justice is not mentioned. The agency that's meant, of course, there are two main antitrust enforcers: Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission is a supposedly independent commission. That's where Lena Khan has tried to revive the quaint mid-20th century idea that big is bad, that big is per se bad. And so the administration says in the AI action plan that we're going to review some of these FTC investigations to see where they have anti-competitive effects. And I will say that, maybe you can point to some examples where antitrust enforcement has benefited competition, but if there's one area of the law, I can't think of an area of the law that more consistently hurts everyone except the intended target, or more consistently produces exactly the opposite of the intended result as antitrust enforcement. And so it's going to be very, one example of that is, I don't know why FTC was going. OpenAI was apparently in talks to buy the startup Windsurf, and then that got abandoned. The option period expired, and then Google came in and hired all of the engineers at Windsurf instead of acquiring the company. And there was a lot of commentary about this, and people were wondering, well, is this because this is just like how this industry needs to move and reallocate and reorganize, and the business model of Silicon Valley, which is to get bought by a big company, for startups to get bought by big companies, is this compatible with the existing system that we have, very onerous system of pre-merger review by FTC and DOJ? And here's an example where the early investors in Windsurf got totally screwed because, arguably, maybe because of pre-merger review. So this is an example of where antitrust enforcement is hurting the little guys and helping to entrench the big guys. And so I think there are novel problems of antitrust and competition policy that are raised by these big new markets that are being created by the big tech companies, and we have to look at those very carefully and be willing to revise traditional precepts of antitrust law where necessary. But I think that it will remain the case that antitrust law consistently produces the opposite of the intended result, and it is a very, very is a tool that has to be used very carefully and very sparingly.
So, as Neil teed up, we've seen that there hasn't necessarily been a ton of congressional action on AI. We had the Take It Down Act get passed. We had consideration of an AI moratorium, but that ultimately failed. Assad, looking to the states, who I think we could argue are operating under a sort of move fast and regulate things, if we are framing this conversation around how do we restore, as you pointed out, the elements of what led us to be on the frontier of AI development, us being the United States compared to our geopolitical rivals, what do you think states should be doing, and what do you think Congress should be doing to ensure that the underlying aims of the AI action plan, which in short are AI dominance, what sort of legislation and action would you like to see coming from the states, and what do you think Congress should be thinking about?
Yeah, I've largely been supportive of the actual laws that have been acted at the state level. I think there's a number that gets thrown around of like there's 1,000 or nearing 1,000 bills. Yeah, but there was like 14,000 bills in Congress last year, right? A bill is a proposal. Most of those don't get any action, including hearings. So to me, when I look at the laws that have been passed, there's some reasonable amount of logic to them. Some of them you might disagree with. Some of them will be conflicting, and that's a great spot for Congress to come in and say, here's a federal standard instead. The Take It Down Act's a great example where actually I think it was like 30 states had a version of that. Now, the Take It Down Act, as far as I remember, doesn't have an explicit preemption, but that's how the Constitution works. If the Take It Down Act gets passed, the state equivalents no longer hold sway. That to me is a reasonable path forward of you pass the commensurate protections. When I look at Tennessee and what it's done with the Elvis Act, that's actually based on a federal bill, but it makes sense to me that the state of Tennessee cares about musicians more than most states, right? So there's a logic to this in the protections of how AI is used. I'm more in the what are the harms we're seeing that states can actually protect their citizens from. I'm less excited about transparency for transparency's sake at the state level. I think it's really important to do at the federal level. But since that hasn't happened in any meaningful way, I think it's okay for states to do that.
So, Neil, this raises a fascinating conversation that you and I have had on a number of occasions of what does it mean for Congress not to act, for states to then intercede in a certain, what some may call a sort of state savior complex of if Congress isn't going to protect us from these risks, well, I, California, or I, New York, or I fill in the blank, we have to do it on behalf of the American people. How are you thinking about this differentiation of responsibilities on realizing this AI dominance goal?
Well, 46 minutes into a Federalist Society podcast, we're talking about federalism. Obviously, our system is set up for there to be arenas in which the states have the overwhelming pejorative to act and areas in which the federal government must act. And so AI, I think, because it's such a vague term, I like to actually just substitute in anytime somebody talks about AI, just say advanced computing instead and see if that like makes things easier. Um, because it's such a broad topic, there are going to be pieces of AI application that are clearly within the state domains, and there are going to be lots of pieces that are going to have a federal or an international effect. And so the risk here is that we have California, we have New York, writing the rules that apply not just to their citizens and to the concerns and the problems that their citizens have, but that set the standard across the country. And in fact, some of the proponents of these bills, including the New York RAISE Act, have explicitly said that they want to set the national standard or maybe even the global standard. And I think that gets Congress's hackles up. I wish it would get Congress's hackles up a bit more to say like, hey, this is actually our job to set those types of frameworks for the types of things that have a global or a international effect. And I think that right sizing of regulation at the federal level and that division of labor between the states and the federal government has to be right in order for us to be competitive and innovative in this space. And so the rush of bills into this space, while many of them don't get passed, I think 70 of them did get passed last term, 70 different AI bills. And I think we're on track for a bunch to get passed this session. And so I think Congress does need to step in here, think hard about what are the right frameworks, what does need congressional action, what can be left to the states, and how do we do it in a way that preserves the innovation and the incentives to build that we need in order for the US to stay ahead of China.
So it has been such an exciting summer. We got the AI action plan and we got ChatGPT 5. We all thankfully have jobs right now. We're all still sentient. None of us are paper clips. Things are going pretty well. But I want to know for our panelists, zooming out as we wrap things up here, what is it that you're going to be paying the most attention to over the next 4 months going into the end of 2025? Are you paying attention to what labs are doing, what China's doing? What for you is the thing that folks should be keeping their eye on over the next 120 or so days? So Mario, why don't we start with you? What are you keeping an eye on?
Well, a lot of different things, Frank, really, but I'll say one that's a good one to keep an eye on, which is goes back to what Neil mentioned, is the emphasis on open models and open weights. This is really an important one to keep an eye on because what's happened in the last 6 months is that the Chinese have come out and just totally dominated the frontier models it, with respect to the ones that are open model and open weight. OpenAI just came out with an open model. I haven't seen the benchmarks on that yet, but Kimi K2, and DeepSeek, and the DeepSeek models are all better than Meta's best open source model, which was until a couple of weeks ago the best American open source model. And this was really a big problem because open source models are getting downloaded all over the world. They're free to use. They can be modified. They're ideal. Because they can be modified, they're ideal for use in universities, as the AI Action Plan recognizes, and by governments. And so can the United States kind of strike back and come out with open source models that are as superior in quality as the closed source models are to everyone else's? In that connection, by the way, I would say one thing that didn't come up here, but which is mentioned several times in the AI Action Plan, is the next shoe to drop from the administration is going to be this national AI research and development strategy. And I think that this is a related thing to pay a lot of attention to, because it's something that it gets mentioned a lot in the AI Action Plan, and it's something that I just happen to know from talking to people the administration is putting a lot of emphasis into.
Okay, and let's go next to Assad. Assad, what are you keeping an eye on?
Yeah, I'll mention a couple of things briefly. One, what I mentioned that the Trump administration's budgets for federal R&D take big slashes to the federal base of research and development, along with firing so many researchers and other things. But ultimately, Congress does appropriations. So what I'm paying attention to is what happens in the next appropriations bill. We've already seen some of the committees up those research numbers from the administration's proposal. To me, that's the kind of thing that matters a lot long term. So you don't see the implications immediately, but you do over a decade. The second is we didn't get too far into like the different ways this stuff can get implemented. Even the like woke AI executive order, I think there is a way of reading it the way Neil said, which is a reasonable cabined, but there's also a way of reading it that's like really, really extreme. And the actual implementation is not the executive order, because that's just a direction to OMB and to others to start doing things. But when those things get done, that's when we'll know in what part of the polls of how this could get implemented did this actually land. And the last one I'll say is I'm paying attention because I'm hopeful, but I have not been encouraged that the quality of our evaluations and benchmarks on how to actually judge these products, it's bad. I know that the companies are investing in this. I know the federal government is, and NIST is, a lot of people are, but that we need to see a step function change in that. And that's where I'm hopeful that something big happens.
Okay, Neil, we started with you. Bring us on home.
So I'm paying a lot of attention to the states. I'll continue to pay a lot of attention to the states. There's a lot of action there. But Congress continues to have an interest in preemption. They have an interest in finding some way to set a federal standard. And I think there will be action on that front this fall. So I'll be paying a lot of attention to that. And then, more big picture, I am really looking to see if we trend towards sort of disaggregating AI into a bunch of different issues, rather than continuing to talk about it as if AI policy is actually a coherent idea. It is not a particularly coherent idea. And we need to dig into like the actual applications, and really that's the only way we're going to be able to make sensible trade-offs between the risks and the benefits when it comes to regulation. And so I'm hoping that states, as they try to grapple with this, they continue to ram their head into this problem. They figure that out. And I think Congress is going to have to run through that education process as well. And so that's what I'm hoping for. That's what I'm looking for. And I'll be looking for any signs that that's actually taking place.
Okay, well, as expected and unsurprisingly, you all have a heck of a lot of homework and a lot of things to keep your eyes on. I'm sure we'll have some forthcoming articles from each of you, and I look forward to sharing them broadly. But otherwise, Libby, thank you so much for providing us with this opportunity.
Awesome. What a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much, Kevin, for moderating. And thank you again to everyone on our panel for joining us and for sharing your insights today. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. For more content like this from the Regulatory Transparency Project and the practice groups here at the Federalist Society, please check out more of our content at fedsoc.org. That is FEDSOC, fedsoc.org. Thank you.